Schaber, if this is something that's attached, Yivaka shal noisa, you want to see what's carrying it. Oh, what just happened? Okay, I hope it's still recording. V'yachkar k'maykin ladas, and then you should also try to understand what type of connection is this? What type of relationship does this have with the other pieces? Im kaidim, if it's prior. Im nimshach, if it's still going on. Im mislava, if it's connected to something else. Im atzmi ve'im mikri, is it an actual thing or is it just something that happens to be? Im bekayach, im bepayel, is it something that's is it potential or is it kinetic? Kulon havchanais lo yishlam tzir and yonizulasam. These are all differentiations that we have to be able to understand about something if we're going to really understand it. And without all of these questions being answered, we won't fully understand anything. And for everything, you should think about the nature of this particular thing. To know if this is something which is ongoing or does it have boundaries. And if it does have boundaries, you should try to figure out what those boundaries are. Because any true concept, Yashuv Kaizev, it's going to end up being wrong. If you connect it to a part that it's not supposed to be connected to, or if you're going to take it out of its boundaries. If you take something out of its context that it belongs, it's just not going to work out right. So, basically what he's saying is you got to really dissect things. If you want to understand them, you have to understand what's the source, what's the outcome, what's the cause, what's the effect, what's the rule, what's an exception to a rule, or what's part of a rule. And you always have to look at things both ways. If something is a part, you need to know, what is it a part of? What's that bigger picture? Right? If you have a question of, which comes first, is this cause that or does this cause that? You have to be able to figure that out, and then you'll know which one's the source and which one follows. And in order to do all of that, you have to ask yourselves these questions in order to get to a proper understanding of anything. Okay. Now, I understand this part is not going to generate a lot of conversation, and that's fine. Once we get into the regular section, we should have much more back and forth. This stuff is pretty, you can't really argue with this. Okay. But you do have to know. The list of details, the parts, the pieces of anything are extremely immense. Way too much for a person to ever comprehend all of it. You can never get to a full knowledge of everything. However, that which you can try to accomplish is to know the rules. If you know the rules, you can figure out the details as they come. But you got to know the rules. That is attainable. He called klal b'tzivay kol pratim hari, because every rule, by definition, will include all sorts of details and parts. Ukshiyasi klal echad, and when you understand one rule, ninsa masing me'ela misra min hapratim, so then you'll automatically understand lots of the parts. You'll understand lots of the pieces that are the results of this rule, are part of this rule. Even though you haven't yet recognized each and every one of them. And maybe you didn't even recognize that these are parts of this particular rule. Nevertheless, you will still already have the knowledge that will allow you to do that as it comes. When any one of those parts comes to you and presents itself, you'll recognize it. Then you'll get it like, oh, this fits into this thing that I've been talking about. I understand that there's something called depression. Oh, now I understand this person's behavior. I might not have made that connection until now. I might have known this person, but until I understood what depression is, I can't recognize and identify this behavior is associated with that. So once I understand the rule, now all of a sudden, every time I walk around, that guy's depressed, that one's depressed, that one's depressed, and I can just label the whole world. Now I know everybody's problem, right? So, but that's the idea. Even if you can't recognize them all in the beginning, but once you have a good handle on the rule, then you'll start being able to associate things to it. What did you say? Yeah, that's the idea. I didn't point at everybody. I only pointed at certain people.
He's selective. And it says that even in other words, even though you don't understand them.
Even though you haven't recognized all the parts, but once you have the rule, you'll slowly start, all the parts will start coming together, and you'll start being able to identify this is part of that rule, this makes sense because of that. Now this all comes together once you have the rule.
Right, it's like having the symptoms. If you have 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7 symptoms of depression, you may not have all the symptoms, but you have 4 or 5 of the symptoms. So now we got these separate parts. Yeah. Each of these symptoms leads us to the general. This person is dealing with depression and or anxiety.
Right.
Just by
or not dealing with it.
Or not.
Right. I will say that we fight against so there's so much in this paragraph that is, for me, bringing up all of the things from an education standpoint. There are graphic organizers that help students understand cause and effect, part, whole, all of that stuff, right? Mm-hmm. When I look at my students, they take these individual classes. By the time they're done with their degree, they're supposed to understand how they fit together, but they don't. Let's put aside the fact that they can't think critically at all anyway. One of the things that I try to do is say, okay, well, you learned this in this class, okay? This is how it applies to this class, so on and so forth, because you have to try to make those connections. It's like, that's
what it's all about.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you realize they got an F in that class, so that's not going to be helpful.
Exactly. I don't.
Okay.
Not most of the time.
I mean, if the kid's struggling, I'm like,
They're probably not sleeping well. They're probably not sleeping well.
Literally the first thing I ask them.
What are the symptoms?
They don't even know.
No.
They think they're sleeping well. They have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. And this is what our sages tell us. The words of Torah should always be in your hand as rules, not as specific pieces. If you just have 100 different details, that's not nearly as useful as having the rule. Once you have the concept, the rule, the overarching concept, the way it works, all the pieces will fall into place. And that's the way we should approach Torah learning. And really anything else, but certainly Torah learning. Okay. However, that which you need to know these rules. You need to know them with all of their boundaries and all of their different applications. And even when it comes to things that in the beginning it doesn't look like it's a big difference. Does it really matter if it's the rule or the part, or if it's part 1 or part 2, or if it's number 37 on the ladder or number 38? Does that really matter? You gotta keep it in mind anyway. Keep that knowledge of that there's a slight difference. Keep it in mind. Leave it on your heart. And don't ignore them. As our sages tell us, because there is nothing small or large in the general rule that doesn't have some place where it makes a difference. There is always going to be some level of difference. It's going to apply somewhere. If you find that within your rule there's a teeny caveat, but in your mind it doesn't matter, you're never going to have a case like that, right? Like, let's say, for example, somebody who is, let's say you notice that there's a difference between someone who is, let's put it this way, you recognize that there's a difference between stubborn and obstinate. But you tell yourself, who cares? It's always going to go together. I'm never going to find someone who's one or not and not the other. They always go together. Understand that that's not the case. If there is a difference, it's going to play out somewhere. Don't just ignore that difference. Understand, there is a tiny difference. It's important. There's going to be some application where that's going to make it split. So don't ignore that difference.
So it's going on the crowd, not the claw.
It's going on the claw. Within this claw that you have, you notice that there's variables. You need to understand those are no. The claw is that I understand there's obstinacy and I understand there's stubbornness. The prat is going to be, where does this work for this person, for that person, in this situation, in that situation? You may not find any case practically where there's a difference between all the details of the obstinate and all the details of the stubborn. They're all going to link up exactly the same, and therefore you'll tell yourself there's no difference. So who cares? Yes, there might be a definition, a difference in the dictionary, but it doesn't really mean anything. The answer is that no, somewhere down the line, within the details, you're going to find that it's going to make a difference. Somewhere, at some place.
But you just said, Yochanan is obstinate and Kirby is stubborn, are you saying that's how it plays out differently because in each person?
No, and I might watch them, and all their tendencies, they'll all be exactly the same. But there's going to be one Shlomo Azel over there who I'm going to realize, oh, he's only got A and not B. And that's where I'll find the difference. And I might have gone through 90% of my life not finding any difference.
That's the prat.
But there will be one time.
That's the prat.
There will be one prat, one down the line. There will be again, but the difference is in the klal. In other words, I might be tempted to ignore,
Right.
and I would be tempted to just connect the obstinacy and the stubbornness. And in my rule of people's understanding of being difficult, those kinds of people, I might just lump those two together and say this is one rule. The answer is no. Within that rule, there are still differences, and it splits into stubbornness and obstinacy, and they'll run almost exactly the same until one part I'll feel, oh, there's a difference. And that's what he's saying. Two Hebrew terms.
Klal and prat, you want to define.
Klal is the rule, prat is the specific detail.
What's the second word?
Prat.
Prat.
Prat. Specific. Like part. The English word part and prat are the same. Okay. Okay. Uma shalayisif layigra b'ktasa pratim, and that which you're not going to add or take away from some of the details, you won't realize that they'll actually end up with a very big difference without them. Klal kulam, and since the rule is a rule that needs to include all of them, this rule needs to include all of the necessary parts to cover all of those details. Because if you find a detail that doesn't fit into any of the rules, that means you've made a mistake in the rules. That means one of your rules is lacking because it doesn't include it, and it has to fall into somewhere. It has to fall into a category, right? Or maybe it's its own category. That means you've mislabeled it. You thought it was a part, and really, it's a rule, right? So you have to be able to recognize that even the small, slight differences can play out into much bigger things down the road. No.
Well, as you go through Derech Hashem, you're going to see you're going to see the brilliance and the majestic thinking, and he's going to put it together for you, and whether we grasp it or not is
right. So that's what he's saying. He's saying you need to try to label everything,
right,
and we're going to work within this and try to do that.
He's trying to open you up, like the rabbi said last week.
Is accidentally linking other things to it.
You're right. That's what he's saying. You have to be careful. That's exactly his point. You got to be careful. You have to really think into things and make sure everything works out.
Otherwise, it's not MS.
Right. And so you might need to make a change. You might have gotten it wrong. I mean, not you, but someone might have gotten it wrong.
How does something become a klal versus a prat?
A klal includes other pratim. A prat is, by definition, part of something bigger. And yes, you need to really think about it to get it. Now, there are practical definitions of this. No, that's not a klal and a prat. An av and a tolda would be like a siba and a mesaviv. More, because it's just one thing that's attached to something else. It's like a subsidiary of it.
Generally something a little bit different than the av.
Right, it's just something that's based on that, but not that. A prat is a part of a piece. Tolda and av is when there are 39 categories of forbidden activity on Shabbos. There are the main categories called the av, which is the father, the main activity, exactly the way it was done in the tabernacle. And then there's toldas, things that are similar to it. So, for example, for the use of the tabernacle, they planted seeds. Planting a tree is not planting seeds. So planting a tree would not be an av. It's not the main category. It's the child. It's the offspring of that category. It's exactly the same prohibition, and there's no difference in punishment or anything. But it's not the actual thing. It's just a development from that.
When you had talked about depression, you weren't saying depression. That's the rule, and the symptoms are the parts, or you were saying that?
I was saying that to define depression, you have to have the symptoms, and the symptoms will define the depression.
Then is analogous to the rule.
The klal and the prat.
Yeah,
I mean,
is that acceptable?
If you have 5 out of the 9, so that's going to
of the pratim
which are the symptoms.
Yeah.
That equals depression, which is the klal.
So again, his goal, he's saying that what we should do is try to understand the rule and not worry about the details. Don't worry about the parts.
From the other way, okay.
Can you? So
So
yes.
in that case,
That's the other way.
what would you? In that case, what would the analogy be to? If depression is the rule, what does that mean to understand that without having to delve into the?
No, you do have to delve into them, but he's saying you'll never get all of them.
Exactly.
So you don't want to
of course.
start from the parts. He says you want to master the rule.
Okay.
And as you master the rule, you understand how depression works. You'll start recognizing, wait, now that I really understand depression, I know that when a person makes that kind of face, that's part of depression, even though I didn't know that until now, and that wasn't in the textbook, but because I really understand depression, I recognize that that is a product of depression. But that's only because I know the rules so well. So I shouldn't focus on the details.
They only create labels based on the product.
Well, that's one method of treating something. But to understand something is a whole different layer. That's his point. That's how he started off. He said, understanding something organized and deep and having everything where it belongs is a whole different experience than simply having a knowledge.
That's why I don't understand how you can know a rule without the pratim.
You can, but you can't know all the pratim. You can't know all the pratim. In other words, if I truly understand what depression is, I'll be able to recognize every symptom as being part of depression. Even if I never knew that was a symptom, when I see it, I'll be like, oh, because I understand how depression works, I know that's a product of it.
That first original understanding of depression?
Oh, so that's what you got to work at. That's what he's saying. He's saying you have to try to understand.
That's the exact opposite of science.
Correct. Science works the other way around. Science is we have scientific theorem is I look at something and then I use it to figure out where that works. Please go.
Because there are many different ways of knowing depending on which, like when you understand science as it exists based on it's based on what's called a positivist point of view. So meaning there's only one truth. This is the truth. We're going to get to it. We do it usually through numbers. There is a whole other realm of research where we do try and look at things, and then that's where the theory develops from. So it's both ways.
So you don't
Okay.
do scientific
So that's the
theory?
pratim, the column, and they're the ones that follow the
If
pratim.
you think
They
about
stay
following
there.
the scientific method.
Well, again, he said in the beginning, you have to go both ways. If you see something you understand this is a part of something bigger, try to understand the bigger part. If you see something has a bigger part, try to understand the pieces. You always want to be going both ways. But he's saying your main focus should never be on the details because you're never going to get there. Your main focus should be understanding the rules. And when you understand the general rules, then all the pieces will fall into place on their own. You'll recognize them
You're going to see
once
where he
you
goes
understand
in the
the
first
rule.
chapter with this because he opens up right with you have. If we
Great.
hopefully we'll get there.
Not today, we won't.
But it's
Or this
a perfect
month.
segue for what he's going to say in the first chapter.
Okay, good.
One
Go
more.
ahead.
One more. So, I don't know to what extent people read this thing called the nosology of depression.
Back to the nose.
Not to the
The nose knows.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it comes from this book called Diagnostic and Statistical Manual
Oh yeah.
from the field of
Good deal.
psychiatry. So most, in my understanding,
next
most
time.
forward-thinking psychiatrists, primary care doctors, researchers, have completely discredited that nosology. And they say that that understanding of depression is really wrong. It's got so many things built into it. It could be 10 different disorders or whatever. And I'm just bringing that out to say, is that part of what you're saying, that when you continue searching to try to understand, you begin to realize, because most people who look at that nosology say, this is ridiculous. There's lots of major scientists who've written articles about discrediting it, say get rid of it. It's a pharmaceutical relationship between creating disorders so you can get a drug to it. And that part is now coming to the forefront, and people are beginning to object more and more about using that. So is that sort of what you're getting at when you say you keep searching and searching because you realize you're going to find things that are going to tell you, oh, I made a mistake. Now I got to come back to my...
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Like I said, if you find a detail doesn't fit into the rule, that means you misunderstood the rule. You got to go back to re-understanding and redrawing your rule,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
for
I hear what you're
other than in the world of Jewish thought, the rest of the world until Einstein came around were firm believers that time is constant, right? Einstein came up with this breakthrough of that time is relative, which was written in old sources of Jewish thought. The Maharal talks about it already way before Einstein came around. But if you came and introduced something like that, everyone would be like, okay, you're crazy, and then it gets proven, and then like, okay, we have to rethink everything now, right? Because we found something that doesn't fit into the rule. We have to understand the rule all over again. The whole concept of time needs to be readdressed and revisited and re-understood and redrawn, because now we realize, hey, we missed the point, and now the whole thing's got to start over. So yeah, absolutely. You got to always be searching. That's it. Okay. What time is it? We're done. My wife has a party that begins in 5 minutes. I got to get out of here. She needs to be at 10:45. Yeah. I got to go. She's got to set up. All right. Thank you all for coming. I'd love to stay in schmooze, but I got to go.
Going to be
Thanks, Rabbi.
45 or 60.